Lord, help us as we continue to work with the Scripture in some detail, especially on some of these texts that really are rather complicated. Give us clarity, Lord, as we think about these, and grant us patience to do the kind of work that will pay off in the long term. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, I want to pick up where I left off last week, and if you have the notes, it's page 12 in the notes. We're still working on slavery, and I'm going to come back to slavery in the next talk because I'm going to take up the slavery text as they occur within the literary framework of the Book of the Covenant. And we started with the Book of the Covenant and did that first passage on slavery, and then turned left and went to Deuteronomy, and right and went to Leviticus, and now we're coming back home to the Book of the Covenant later today. But I just want to clean up a few other texts. The kidnapping text we'll take up maybe even later today in the next talk. I want you to look at Deuteronomy 23. If you don't have the notes where I've written it out, you can look in your Bibles. I haven't done a detailed piece of work on this. If you look at the context looks like a grocery list, and I can't see how to make any sense out of it other than that. It deals with a whole assortment of rules, and right in the middle of that it says this, Deuteronomy 23:15, if a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand him over to his master. Let him live among you wherever he likes and in whatever town he chooses. Do not oppress him. Now, this, as many have said, is an absolutely astounding text, because the law of Hammurabi and all the other laws, the laws of the ancient Near East, are quite clear what you do with a runaway slave. I've actually written out two of the laws. Law of Hammurabi 16 and 19. Let me just read them to you from my notes. If a man should harbor a fugitive slave or a slave woman of either the palace or of a commoner in his house, and not bring him out at the herald's public proclamation, that householder who's harboring a runaway slave will be killed. The death penalty is what they inflict on people for harboring runaway slaves. Law 19. If he should detain that slave in his own house, and afterward the slave is discovered in his possession, that man shall be killed. I couldn't be much clearer. Now, two or three observations. The first one is, the slave in question in the biblical text is most likely a foreign slave. Now, and Baker, and you see the footnote on Baker, Baker argues that in great detail, but if you read widely enough, you'll realize there's some other very competent Old Testament scholars who do not think it was a foreign slave. But let's start with the idea that it was a foreign slave, because that's less explosive. So the slave in question here that the Israelites are to harbor is someone's run away from Egypt or from Assyria or from some other neighboring company and has come to Israel to find refuge. They are a refugee in that sense. If he were an Israelite, he would be called a brother and would probably return to his own home area. That's the contextual argument that's made, the primary one, for the fact that he's a foreign slave and not a local slave. The fact that he may choose anywhere in Israel to live is evidence that he probably does not belong to a tribe or clan, the argument being that he would go back to his own area and wouldn't have to choose. And I feel the weight of those arguments. Number two, this law stands, as said above, in stark contrast to the Code of Hammurabi 16 and 19. Within Israel, to harbor a runaway slave is an act of justice. Can I say that again? Within Israel, to harbor a runaway slave was an act of justice and righteousness, for it is obedience to the law, the standard of righteous conduct. But in the law of Hammurabi, the harboring of a runaway slave is the opposite. It is injustice, which is punishable by death. We haven't talked much about the death penalty. Eventually we'll come around to that and talk a bit more about it. We pause to note that the law of Hammurabi inflicts the death penalty for stealing a possession. That's what a chattel slave is. The death penalty is well known in the law of Moses, but it is never imposed for stealing possessions. In Israel, people are more important than possessions. It is for the taking of the life of a person not the stealing of a possession, that the death penalty is imposed. So we have a number of little windows here. The second one that I'm opening up here is the fact that within the ancient Near East, sometimes possessions were prioritized above persons. And so you inflicted the death penalty for stealing a possession. That no one ever gets put to death for stealing in Israel. Just doesn't happen. Number 3, what might be the implication of this law within Israel itself? Well, it's not clear from the text what implication might be drawn. Some, and I mention here Brueggemann and Kleins and Krusman, argue that this means the dismantling of slavery laws, but such a conclusion would be possible only if the slave were an Israelite or possibly a non-Israelite living in Israel, but not a non-Israelite from a foreign country. So if you think the slave is a non-Israelite, the idea that this leads to the dismantling of slavery probably doesn't work. But you see, I'm going to come back to it in comment number 6 below. Number 4, for Israel not to return runaway slaves, as was common practice and law in Mesopotamia, put Israel at odds with its surrounding powerful neighbors. These countries maintained international treaties which had extradition clauses for the return of runaway slaves. And I've listed for you the places where you can go find the evidence. There's really not a dispute or disagreement on that. So countries had, Hittites and so on, had extradition treaties where if a runaway slave went to this country, then he was returned. Now think about the fact what happens now that Israel doesn't participate. Such a stance on runaway slaves certainly set Israel apart, making them, in the biblical sense, holy or separate from the surrounding nations. So this put them at odds with their neighbors and made them distinct from the neighbors and made them holy. Merrill notes that this law about the runaway slave, and I am going to give you a little context here via Merrill, he calls it purity in treating the disadvantaged people, is bracketed by laws about purity in personal hygiene and purity in cultic personnel. So he says what holds these laws together is a sense of purity. Now, for most of us, that's just off the map. We just don't have, purity means washing your hands after you use the bathroom. But that has nothing to do with Israel. Purity in Israel is an entirely different subject, and eventually we'll come to it as a maintenance mechanism for keeping Israel just. They had to be pure, which made them holy. And he's making that comment here, and I just note that in passing. This setting apart or purity surely is part of what Deuteronomy 4, 1 through 8 is talking about when it says, and here I'm going back and quoting a verse that we looked at before, observe them carefully, that is the laws, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. And then verse 8, and what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today? Now, if you think about that, who is it in Mesopotamia that would say about Israel, boy, that's a great law, this protecting runaway slaves? Well, it's not going to be the slave owner. Is that right? And the Code of Hammurabi, and I don't want to get myself in too deep here, but the Code of Hammurabi is written from the point of view of the king. It's written from the top down. All right? Now, I'm not in a position today to argue the case that the law of Moses, although it's written by Moses, who's on the top, has much more of a bottom-up feel to it than a top-down. And I certainly don't want to get into the jurisprudence systems of the world and ask, are they top-down or are they bottom-up? How are these things made? But this must surely be from the perspective of, and remember, Mesopotamia is a tiered society with the elite at the top who are landholders, the middle section who are not landholders, and then slaves. This must clearly be from the perspective of what one might call the oppressed majority. That is, everybody underneath the elite. So the middle section, which is, we don't want to call middle class because that brings in all kinds of wrong understandings, but that middle section of persons who don't own land, and then, of course, the slaves. It must be these middle people to whom Moses is saying, or about whom Moses is saying, those people, not the people at the top, those people will say, boy, Israel must be a very nice place to live. And I've given it to in the highly modernized Living Translation, haven't I? But that's the gut feeling. Israel must be a very nice place to live. And of course, that's going to be central to the argument that we're trying to develop about the just society. That the just society, the cutting edge of God's witness to his character, lies partly in the character of his people in their structural relations to each other. Not just their interpersonal charity, of which there's almost none, but in the structural way they are put together as a just society. And when you couple that with God's mighty acts and the proclamation of justice, then you have a powerful witness to the neighbors. And I will call that later on the bringer of justice model, and I think that's what's really transferable into our own day and age. But we've got a little ways to go before we assemble all those bricks. 5. Surely this raises the question how this law in Deuteronomy 23 is to be squared with the parenthetical statement. Remember last week we talked about the fact that when you go through the 4 stages of dropping into poverty in Leviticus 25, right in the middle of stage 3, you get this parenthesis that says, oh, by the way, you may buy slaves, but you have to buy them from foreigners, and you can will them to your children as chattel, into parenthesis. Remember that? And you say, what in the world is that doing there? And the question now comes to me, and I hope it comes to you too, is how do you square Deuteronomy 23 about harboring a runaway slave who's a chattel slave with the ability to buy slaves in Leviticus 25? Surely the direct statement of Deuteronomy 23 should take precedence over the parenthetical statement of Leviticus 25. Now, let me just tell you what I'm doing. I'm working as a conservative. I'm working as an evangelical who's committed to the integrity of the text in the sense that it does make sense. If I had the permission in my soul to do what most of my fellow colleagues do, I would say, oh, isn't this interesting how Moses got it wrong here? Of course, it wasn't Moses. It was somebody much, much later in the 6th century or maybe even post-exilic. Or I would use these 2 passages to play off each other so as to develop an idea about how the original Book of the Covenant got revised by the Deuteronomic Code and then revised by the Levitical Code. And some people play it all the way around the other way around and say Deuteronomy was first. And oh my, the games, and I do say that carefully, the games that can be played with the text, and I have a whole stack of books on my desk that big that play those games, are incredible. But I think that the right game to play with this text is to see if we can't make sense of how the pieces go together. And I must say to you, quite frankly, I don't quite see this. I'm going to say it in print here. Assuming that the author of the Pentateuch understood what he was writing, and I don't know that that's necessarily an evangelical proposition. I think that's just good common sense, and was not given to contradictions. Although we do make contradictions, don't we? I mean, we humans do make contradictions. There must be some facet of the matter that eludes us. Maybe I should say me. I don't want to speak for you. Some facet of the matter that eludes me because we are 3,000 years removed from the text, not to mention a completely different culture and language. So, I'm happy to say I've got a problem here. And I've learned to use in my old age punctuation other than underline and exclamation point in my Bible. If you look at my Bible, I hope you won't look at it, but if you look at my Bible, you'll find it's got a lot of question marks. Lord, what is this about? And next to Leviticus 25:44 is a big question mark saying, so what's this about? And I really don't know. The best I can say is it's parenthetical, you've got other texts. And so when we try to put all these texts together about slavery, we can't leave that brick out just because we don't like it, but we need to put it together with all the other bricks. And now let me just step out of text for a second and say, what I'm trying to model here is what you have to do in every single theological issue. Are you a Calvinist or a God-fearing Arminian? Well, the Calvinists have a whole pile of texts, and the Arminians have a whole pile of texts. But by and large, they're different piles. You with me? And of course, the right answer is, since all those bricks are in God's Bible, you need to build a model using all the bricks. You can't use the bricks that you like and then put some of the bricks to the side. You with me? I wrote my first master's thesis on the building of models of holiness. And I looked at the Wesleyans, the Arminians, and the Reformed. And in each case, they get their own particular pile of bricks and they build this. And the other bricks they sort of shove off to the side and say, well, those bricks are cracked or not quite acceptable, or, they're the foundation, you can't see it. And we all do the same thing. You with me? So, the right thing to do here, and it's very hard to do this, isn't it? And this is where we need the Holy Spirit. Not to tell me the meaning, but to remind me and to help me use all the bricks. And so when we finally put together the question about slavery, at least in the law, I'm not going to be free to set that brick aside, but I can say it's parenthetical. Now 6, let me come back to this question again about who the slaves are. Finally, it surely is possible that although the law applied primarily to runaway foreign slaves, and I think that probably is true, nevertheless, there may have been occasions when Israelite slaves ran away if they were badly treated by a master. So you can imagine a slave way up in Dan escaping to Beersheba, and they didn't have iPhones, or, once he was gone, who would know you couldn't find him, right? And if he came to Beersheba, was it your responsibility to harbor a runaway Israelite slave? Now, if this is true, then we must revisit Brueggemann's statement about the dismantling of slave laws. Do you see how that undermines it? If you treat your slave bad, and you've already been told not to deal with them ruthlessly, but if you treat them bad, they can simply run away. And the people at the other end of Israel are to harbor them. At least that's one way of possibly reading the text. All right, I'm going to leave that with you and move on to the next talk, talk number 33. We haven't finished all the slave text yet. There's about 5 more to take up in the Book of the Covenant, and I want to take them up embedded in the Book of the Covenant. Oh, they've taken the clock off the wall, haven't they? That's unfortunate, isn't it? I better put my watch out here so I can at least see what time it should be. All right. If you have talk 33, and I want you to look at your Bibles, and I'm in 2 or 3 different minds about what to do with this. We have been working, and you may not remember this because we've gone so far astray. We've been working in the Book of the Covenant. And the Book of the Covenant, which is Exodus 20 through 23, I think it's 18 or 19, is a development of the Ten Commandments, which of course is Exodus 20, and we can see some of the commandments. The first section was commandments 1, 2, and 3 about being right with God, and those were developed in Exodus 20, 20 through, I think it's 23, 24, 25, I forgot the precise numbers. And then we had a little statement up here about the Mishpatim in 21:1, and then 21:2 through 11, we had the laws about slaves, about men slaves that were sold for debt, and women slaves that were sold to be concubine or to be wives. Now we come to the next major section, and I want to suggest that striking is the key here, and it runs from 21:12, and I would think it runs all the way to 36. Now, not everybody's on board with me on that, but I think that's a possibility. The word striking, look at 21:12 in your Bible. Anyone who strikes. Now, that word strike, which gets terribly obscured in the NIV, but not in the New Revised Standard, nor in the ESV. So most of the other translations keep it clean. NIV really garbles it. Anyone who strikes a man and kills him shall surely be put to death, which is sort of the head note for this section. And all the way through this section then, you pick up the theme of striking. And it's striking one person one way or striking another person another way. So after we've had the discussion about commandments 1, 2, and 3, and this is commandment 4, because although the release of the slave is not based on the calendar, it is based on the rhythm of 6 in and 7th out. You with me? And Deuteronomy places the calendar and the rhythm together in Deuteronomy 15, as does Leviticus. So I think we're on safe ground for saying that the slave law is a spin-off of the 4th. Now, the striking law is the 6th commandment. You shall not murder. Strike means to kill. And sandwiched into that is the 5th commandment about parents. And we'll see that other commandments get picked up. The 7th commandment on adultery is missing. And my wife said to me, why is it missing? And of course the answer is, I don't know. But the 8th commandment on stealing is the next major section. So if we get to it, we'll have a whole long section, starting with chapter 23, verse 1, about stealing. And that's obviously the 8th commandment. And then we're going to have a section down here about justice in the courts, which of course is the 9th commandment. So the book of the covenant really does take seriously the 10 commandments, and even takes seriously the order in which they're given, and it is trying to elaborate on those and expound on those and help Israel to be in a position to understand them. Now, I think I probably said enough about the literary location and the unity of the text. I'm going to take time just to read the text with you, because I think it's important to get the feel and make a few comments about where the word striking is and about how the text holds together. As we read it, you will see that at least on the first reading, unless you're being coached, it doesn't really work. It doesn't really hold together. But I think it's possible. Let's try it now. 12, verse 12. Anyone who strikes, and it's nakah in Hebrew, anyone who strikes a man and kills him shall surely be put to death. That's the head note. That's the major one. And notice that that is apodictic. It's a direct command. It's not an if-then clause. However, and here comes the if-then clauses, if he does not do it intentionally, but God lets it happen, he is to flee to the place I will designate. But if a man schemes and kills another man deliberately, take him away from my altar and put him to death. And we'll come back and talk about the place I designate in my altar. Verse 15. Then you get 3 more strikings. Anyone who, and the NIV says attack, but it's our word strike again, nakah. Anyone who strikes his father or his mother is to be put to death, and presumably struck in such a way as to kill them. Anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or still has him when he is caught must be put to death. And so here we have another little piece about slavery, which we'll come back and work on later. But kidnapping is put in the same rank as striking. You take someone's life away. And then verse 17, anyone who curses, and we'll have to come back and ask what cursing means, his father or his mother must be put to death. Then the gears shift a little bit. Verse 18. If men quarrel and one strikes, NIV says hit, but it strikes, and strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die, but is confined to bed, the one who strikes, struck, past tense is correct, the blow will not be held responsible if the other gets up and walks around outside with his staff. However, he must pay the injured man for the lost time and see that he is completely healed. So here he introduces a theme, and depending on what era you were raised in, the King James language or NIV, restitution. Do you know the word restitution? Or restoration? Or something, reparations? Here the law begins to see that, and especially when we get into property law, there'll be a lot of talk about restitution, but you already get it here. Verse 20, if a man beats his male or female slave with a rod, and the slave dies as a direct result. Now let me just pause and say, how horrible. And we're talking about an Israelite beating a chattel slave. So let's not gloss this. I mean, oh dear. He must be, and here's the punch word, punished. And we'll come back and talk about that in the next talk. But he is not to be punished if the slave gets up after a day or two, since the slave is his property. That law cuts both ways, and we'll come back and think about that one. That's a really difficult one. Now, the difficulties don't end, do they? Verse 22. If men who are fighting strike, the word hit in the NIV, strike, a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the courts allow. But if there is serious injury, that is death, all right? And let me just pause for a second and say the question here is obviously who dies? The baby, the mother, or both? And it's this text more than any other text that's used on the abortion system. You with me? And I'll give you footnotes and tell you where to look on that and at least give you my opinion. But this is the text that's used on the abortion issue. But you can just tell by reading it, there's a little bit of obscurity here about who dies. But if there's a serious injury, verse 23, you are to take, now watch this, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. It's called in Latin, and of course you have to do Latin to be able to do theology, don't you? It's called lex talionis, the law of retribution. Or as it comes across to us, the law of equality. It's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's not you knock out my eye and I knock off your head. You see the difference? And of course we always read it, oh, how terrible, an eye for an eye. But we will read it in its context where it's supposed to actually go the other direction. It's to contain vengeance. Then verse 26, where the lex talionis, which is the central part of justice, is picked up. If a man hits, and it's our word strike again, a manservant or a maidservant in the eye and destroys it, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the eye. And if you knew the Code of Hammurabi, you'd say, oh, wow. If you're going to lose your eye, best to do it in Israel. If you're a slave, because you're going to get freedom. If he knocks out the tooth of a manservant, sort of the other end of the scale, I'd rather lose my tooth than my eye, or a maidservant, he must let the servant go free for compensation for the tooth. Oh, and we'll talk about that. And then verse 28, a lot of people draw a line and say, a new section. But I'm going to suggest that it's not a new section. In verse 36, I'll try to show that. But now we get into a section that's really complicated. There are more parallels to the law about striking a pregnant woman and this next section about the goring ox in the ancient Near Eastern texts than any other law. So this passage, these 10, 12 verses we're reading here, have more parallels, not just in the Code of Hammurabi, but in other codes, than any of the other laws in the book of Moses. So you get a lot of discussion here about, how does this relate to the other laws, and we'll certainly touch on that as we go along. Verse 28, if a bull gores, now the word is gore, not strike, because apparently bulls don't strike, they gore. And I would argue it's the same thing though. If a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull must be stoned and its meat must not be eaten. But if the owner of the bull will not be held responsible, but the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull had been in the habit of goring, and the owner had been warned, but not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or a woman, the bull must be stoned, and the owner must be put to death. However, don't you like these howevers? Just when you think you got the law down where you can make it work. However, if payment is demanded of him, that is the owner, he may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. Now there's a law over in Numbers 25 that says, under no circumstances may a murderer pay his way out of the death penalty. You with me? So we're going to have to ask, how can this guy pay his way out? And I think there's an answer to that one, but we'll come back to it. Verse 31, this law also applies if the bull gores a son or a daughter. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull must be stoned. If a man uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit must pay for the loss. He must pay its owner, and the dead animal will be his. Oh, have we strayed off target? Verse 35, if a man's bull, we're back to the bull now, injures the bull of another man, so we had a bull goring a man, a bull goring a son, a daughter, and a slave. Now we have a bull goring a bull. All right, you follow how it's going. If a man's bull injures the bull of another man and it dies, they are to sell the live one and divide both the money and the dead animal equally. However, if it was known that the bull had been in the habit of goring, yet the owner did not keep it penned up, the owner must pay. Now watch the next three words. What does he pay? How does justice work? It's a justice question, isn't it? How does he pay? Animal for animal. What do you hear there? It's the lex talionis, isn't it? Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, foot for foot, animal for animal. And so I would argue that although the word striking leaves off, before the word striking leaves off, the lex talionis has been introduced, and it's the lex talionis then that couples down to the animal world, and so the whole passage hangs together around striking, supplemented with the lex talionis, and so I would take it as a whole and try to treat it that way, although the world won't turn upside down if we find that it works some other way. Now I'm on the middle of page 1, the structure of the passage, and I've just rehearsed that for you, the strikings, and you can see that there. The striking resulting in death or something close to that, death penalty. Striking resulting in injury but not death, compensation or restitution. Striking a slave in a way that may result in the death of the slave, death penalty applied. I'm going to argue that. Striking a pregnant woman, lex talionis introduced. Striking an eye or a tooth of a slave, lex talionis applied. Striking or goring of an oxen, lex talionis applied. Now, I want to step back a little bit and ask about how this fits into justice. And so again, I want to come back to my heuristic and my model of the star of justice with its 6 points. Forensic justice, which has to do with judging. And then on the right, I always put retributive justice, the idea of punishment. Distributive justice or restorative justice, the idea of lifting up. The standard of justice, which is what we're dealing with here, the mishpatim of 21:1, and then conduct, which is measured according to the standard of justice by the judge, who either inflicts retribution or gives you a reward. So the whole thing flows together. Now, in this passage, I find 3 different aspects of justice. This section deals with 3 of the 6 facets of justice in the star of justice. First, it addresses the issue of retributive justice, that is, the death penalty for striking. So we'll look here at the death penalty. And it is an act of retribution, that people were put to death for certain crimes. Secondly, this passage discusses restitution of the victim that was struck. If you beat up a guy, you got to pay for his time off, and you've got to make sure he gets well. You got to pay the doctor's fees. If you poke an eye out of your servant, you got to let him go free. You poke the tooth out. So this is distribution. This is where you're going to restore something, and so it touches on that facet. And then I think most importantly, and this is the third facet. Thirdly, it lays out the core of the star of justice, which is fairness in terms of the famous eye for eye. So right at the center of this is eye for eye, the so-called lex talionis. And I would suggest for you that this at the center is adverbial to all the actions that go on, or adjectival in some cases, I presume, but retribution is to be done fairly. Distribution, restoration is to be done fairly. And that all these mark that out. And I think we probably understand that even within our own system. When you ask little children, what does it mean to be just? The answer is to be fair, right? And so right at the heart, eye for eye is actually, when we get to it and look at it, and understand how it worked in its context, is actually a statement of fairness, not of revenge, as it's sometimes mistakenly thought to be, mainly because the people read Bible backwards, and they've heard Jesus say, "You have heard it said of old, but I say to you." And he's not repudiating, at least I will argue, he's not repudiating Moses, he's repudiating the false interpreters of Moses, the Pharisees and the scribes, and actually trying to restore the original standard of justice in that sense. Now, page 2. And I'm going to skip the challenge of this passage. We've already talked about that a little bit. And let me just move to the text. And I've read the text to you once here, and I've laid the text out for you again, so I'm not going to go back and read this. I'm going to deal with verses 12 through 17 here and make some observations about the text, 3 or 4 observations. So I'm in part 3 now, observations on the text. Forms used in the text, they are apodictic and case study. That is, verse 12 starts out with, anyone who strikes a man and kills him. This is very much like the Ten Commandments. It's not an if-then. So to say that the Ten Commandments are the only place that you find thou shalt, and this is only if-then, is not quite true. You have apodictic laws here, and here is one of them. So we just need to note that. The focus is on the 6th commandment, but also the 5th commandment. The 6th commandment, of course, is about murder, about striking, about killing. But it's also in the 5th commandment because you have the striking of a parent, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. There are 3 different kinds of killings. Now we begin to talk like lawyers, don't we? And of course, this is a law. Those that involve premeditation and intention, verse 14, if a man schemes and kills another man deliberately, he's put to death. And those that are unintentional, if he does not do it intentionally, but God let it happen. All right? So there's a distinction between intentional and unintentional. Now, within this system, apparently the way it worked, at least at the tribal level in the early days, was if someone got killed, it was the brother's responsibility, or the nearest kin, to go and to kill the killer, to revenge. And he's called the avenger of blood. You'll find it repeated about 6 or 7 times in the text. No, the text is taken as a whole. And so the avenger of blood did that. The asylum, the altar, the cities of refuge, which we'll talk about when we deal with the structural issues, because it's really a structural issue. But the city of refuge, if you killed someone unintentionally, and probably people who killed them intentionally also, would run to one of the 6 cities of refuge, and then at the city of refuge, a legal procedure took place, and we'll come to that eventually, but not right away. It's described in Deuteronomy 19 and elsewhere. So there was this provision for unintentional and intentional killing. Below, we shall discover a 3rd category, killing as a result of negligence. This is the guy with the bull who's been warned but didn't pen up his bull, and his bull goes and kills somebody. Did he do it with premeditation? No. Did he do it with intent? No. Was he negligible? Yes. Did someone get killed? Yes. What's the penalty? Death. Is there a possibility for a payoff? Well, if it's intentional, the answer is no, right? If it's unintentional, then of course he didn't really kill him, and certain things apply. But if it's negligence, then you get a different law. You begin to see how jurisprudence is laid out here? Now, it's not for me to say, but I have a book sitting on my desk looking at me, as many books are, which I haven't read, but I've put my hand on and breathed deeply several times, written by a Jewish scholar who argues that the basic jurisprudence system of the West does not come from Rome and Greece, it comes from Hebraic thinking, which maybe was mediated in part through Rome and Greece. And it'll be a fascinating read, and I will try to read it and digest it and tell you about it next year. But you can begin to see some of the seeds of that kind of thinking. Top of page 3, place I will designate and my altar. You saw those there. I will put this aside and deal with it when we come to the cities of refuge, because those are structural issues. and we will look at the Constitution and ask how the cities of refuge figured into the jurisprudence system. There are 3 other cases of striking which deserve the death penalty, and I read those for you. Those are about, let me go back and look at them again. Verse 15, anyone who strikes his father or mother must be put to death. And apparently, they actually strike them in such a way as to kill them. That would be one possible reading. You could read the text less strongly, and you still get the death penalty. The second one is anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or still has him when he is caught. Now, I want to look at a slightly different translation because it certainly is interesting. Look at 3:7. Let's see if I can find my translation here. 3:5, the last line in 3:5. The English Standard Version says, whoever steals a man and sells him, comma, and anyone found in possession of him. Now that would be somebody else, wouldn't it? Shall be put to death. Now, if that's the right translation, and I've seen commentators work on this, and I really haven't had enough time to judge it, but if that's really the right way to read the Hebrew text, it's not just the kidnapper of slaves, it's the person who bought the kidnapped slave.
Did he know it?
Well, did he know it? Well, these are all good questions. If we come to our own context, did people in the South know that the black Africans had been kidnapped? I mean, how could they not? You say, but they were kidnapped by other Africans. Yes, that's true in many cases, but nonetheless, they were kidnapped. And they were buying stolen goods. Yeah, okay. So, I mean, these are all bricks we want to put together. And I'm not going to do it in this class, but Mark Knowles asked it, how in the world did Southern evangelicals defend slavery? It's an interesting hermeneutical exercise, which probably is safe for us because it is, at least for us, we think, dead. Right? Now, if you do it with women, well, anybody who does anything with women is silly in the first place, aren't they? I mean, I got 4 daughters and 1 wife, and I wouldn't think of even touching the women's issue. But a dead issue, but you can learn from the hermeneutics of a dead issue as to what people did wrong, and it might enlighten live issues, which is precisely what that book I showed you earlier by Webb is trying to do, okay? And so you can see that these are not dead issues, they're really quite live issues. And then finally, the final one, verse 17, anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. The modern commentators all try to turn curse into something else. Having lived in Africa for the last 25 years, I would take curse as curse. When I was a young missionary, my teacher said to me, Chester, wag kang bumonto sa balite ang mga muto there. My Tagalog's not very good, but Chester, don't go over and sit under the balite tree because at night the ghosts come out. Well, I laughed. When I left the Philippines, I stopped laughing. I would not sit under the balite tree at night because you know that there's ghosts there. And the idea about curse, the Bible takes cursing very seriously. Africans take cursing very seriously. I think this probably really is curse, not in the sense that you say a bad word about your father or your mother, but that you put a curse upon them to bring them to grief. And so I would take it in that sort of context, and the response to that is death. Now, at the bottom of page 372, penalty for killing depends on social class or person. I want to look at a little bit of the ancient Near Eastern laws here. I'll start with 371. Murder comes first in all the codes except one of the ancient Near East. So this one puts God first, and then it deals with slaves, and then it comes to murder. But the Code of Hammurabi, Law 1, is about murder. Now, it's not developed until much later, but the other ancient Near Eastern codes, says Barmish, who wrote on this for her doctorate, 5 out of 6 all put murder first. So it gives you a little window into what they were thinking about. Murder is the most important thing. And I want to come back and make the point again. Within Israelite culture, the most important thing is being right with God. And then when you come to the social section, the most important thing is to get slavery right. Boy, the ancient Near Eastern Code doesn't do that. Right? This is subversive. And we want to take it as a whole, but we're picking up the bricks, we're picking up the pieces, so we can build that big picture someday. The second comment here, penalty for killing depends on social class of a person in the ancient Near Eastern Code. In the A&E, the penalty for murder depends on the class of person killed. If an upper class person kills an upper class person, the penalty is death. Right? If the upper class person kills a commoner, the penalty is 30 shekels. If the upper class person kills a slave, the penalty is 20 shekels. And I've given you the reference to the Code of Hammurabi 209 to 214 and Barmish's discussion of that. As we have already seen and shall see again later, the Book of the Covenant makes no class distinctions among Israelites themselves. Israelite debt slaves are not a permanent class. You're in for 6 years and you're out. Nor between Israelites and non-Israelite chattel slaves when it comes to the death penalty for killing. And we'll come to that text a little later on. If you kill a chattel slave, you'll be put to death. At least that's the way I would read the text later on when it comes to that. Now, that means that the law of Moses then stands in striking contrast to the ancient Near Eastern Code when it comes to meting out penalties. That in Israel, it really is a level situation, that you don't have class distinctions. But in Mesopotamia, the justice system is embedded in a caste system. And caste trumps justice. Whereas God says, no, there is no caste. There's only one class of people. They're Israelites. You're brothers. It's a brotherhood. And we've talked about that before, but we come back to that again here. Now, finally, compensation. Compensation for an intentional murder is not mentioned here. It is mentioned later in Numbers 35, where it's rejected. But in some of the ancient Near Eastern laws, compensation is allowed. And I just mentioned the laws and say that. What it means in shorthand is if you're wealthy and you're allowed compensation, you can murder somebody, and instead of being put to death yourself, you pay your way out of it. So even if you murder someone of your own caste, there's the possibility of compensation and buying your way out of that.